The small town of Hollow Creek was quiet, nestled between hills that seemed to trap the fog. Everyone knew everyone in this place. There were no secrets, or so people thought. But there was one man no one really knew, old Mr. Thompson. He lived alone in a house at the edge of the town, a house that everyone avoided. The house had dark windows, and it was always surrounded by an eerie silence. People who dared to pass by said they could hear strange sounds coming from the place at night. The air around it always felt heavier, as if something dark and evil hung over it. Mr. Thompson was the kind of man people whispered about behind their backs. He was always seen walking the streets at odd hours, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his slow, careful steps making no sound on the ground. The children dared each other to run past his house at night, but no one ever went near it after dark. One afternoon, just as the sun began to set, a young woman named Rochelle moved into a small house on the same street. She had heard the rumors about Mr. Thompson, but she didn't believe in such things. She thought it was all just gossip. Rochelle had recently moved to the town to start fresh, away from the noise of the city. She was looking for peace. Little did she know, the town she had chosen to escape had its own dark secrets. On her first evening in the new house, Rochelle decided to go for a walk to explore the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the wind rustling the leaves on the trees. She walked past Mr. Thompson's house without a second thought. The shutters on the windows were closed tightly, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. But as Rochelle walked by, she noticed something odd. The front door of the house was slightly ajar. She stopped for a moment, wondering why someone would leave it open like that. Curiosity got the best of her, and without thinking, she took a step toward the door. It creaked as if inviting her in, but before she could take another step, she heard a voice behind her. "Don't go in there." Rochelle turned around quickly. It was Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor from across the street. The older woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Why?" Rochelle asked, confused. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Johnson hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. "That man is dangerous," she whispered. "You have no idea what he's capable of." Rochelle felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the rumors, but they always seemed exaggerated. Now, standing so close to the house, she was beginning to feel uneasy. But she wasn't the type to back down from fear. "I'm sure he's just old and harmless," Rochelle said, trying to reassure herself. Mrs. Johnson grabbed her arm, her grip strong despite her age. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen anything like him. People have disappeared, Rochelle. People have vanished, and they were last seen near his house. Don't go near him." Rochelle pulled her arm away, her heart racing. "You're just making this up," she said, trying to laugh it off. But the fear in Mrs. Johnson's eyes was real. Rochelle could see it, and for the first time, she felt a growing sense of dread. She gave a quick nod to the old woman and hurried back to her house, the image of Mr. Thompson's dark house lingering in her mind. That night, as Rochelle lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The house was quiet, the only sound being the wind outside. But then, from the corner of her room, she thought she saw something, a shadow, moving. She jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of her new home. Rochelle shook her head, trying to push the thought out of her mind, but she couldn't help it. Something was wrong with Mr. Thompson, and she was about to find out just how wrong. Chapter 2. The kidnapping. The days passed, and Rochelle tried to forget about the unsettling feeling she had after her brief encounter with Mrs. Johnson. But no matter what she did, she couldn't get the image of Mr. Thompson's house out of her mind. It seemed to draw her in, like some invisible force pulling her toward it. One afternoon, as Rochelle went for a walk again, she noticed something strange. A young man named Marco, who worked at the local grocery store, was walking down the street. He smiled at her as they passed each other, but there was something off about him. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he was being followed. Rochelle watched him walk past Mr. Thompson's house, and for a moment, she thought she saw Marco glance toward the dark windows. The next day, Marco was nowhere to be found. Rochelle went about her day, trying not to think about it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. That evening, she noticed the door to Mr. Thompson's house was wide open again. This time, she couldn't resist. She walked over, her heart pounding in her chest, and peeked inside. The house was dark, the air thick with dust. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she stepped inside. Everything was still. There were no signs of life. But as she walked deeper into the house, she found something that made her blood run cold. In the living room, hidden behind a large, dusty curtain, was a door leading down to a basement. Rochelle's curiosity got the best of her, and before she could stop herself, she descended into the darkness. Her heart raced with each step. She reached the bottom and gasped. The walls were covered with strange drawings, symbols Rochelle had never seen before. But what made her stomach churn was the sight of old, rusted chains hanging from the ceiling. The room smelled of rot and decay. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind her. She turned around quickly, panic rising in her chest. From the shadows, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, a twisted smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and cold. Rochelle's breath caught in her throat as Mr. Thompson moved closer, his footsteps slow but deliberate. She tried to back away, but the door had locked behind her, trapping her in the basement. The cold, damp air made it hard to breathe, and the shadows seemed to grow darker the longer she stood there, frozen in fear. "What do you want?" Rochelle stammered, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson's smile grew wider, his yellow teeth gleaming in the dim light. He seemed almost amused by her fear. "What I want, my dear, is very simple. People come to this town, and they disappear, and no one ever asks why." He paused, watching her reaction. "But you, Rochelle, you've been asking questions. You've been poking around where you shouldn't. You've seen things that no one is meant to see." Rochelle's heart raced as she backed up against the cold stone wall of the basement. She had heard the rumors, but now that she was standing face to face with Mr. Thompson, they seemed so much worse. The creepy stories, the disappearances, everything was real, and she was in the middle of it. "Why are you doing this?" Rochelle demanded, trying to keep her voice steady, though fear was clawing at her chest. Mr. Thompson tilted his head, as if considering her question. "Why? Because it's the only way. It's the way I've always done it. Kidnap them, break them, and then silence them forever." The word sent chills down Rochelle's spine. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "What do you mean, silence them forever?" Mr. Thompson took a step closer, his smile never fading. "I've been doing this for years, my dear. Years and years. The ones who are weak, who ask too many questions, they are the ones who never leave. They don't get to go back, and they never will." Rochelle's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She looked around the basement desperately, but there was no escape. The walls were bare, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. The chains hanging from the ceiling rattled ominously as a gust of wind swept through the room. Suddenly, Rochelle's eyes landed on a small window high up on the wall. It was too small for her to fit through, but maybe she could break it. She needed to act fast. She glanced at Mr. Thompson, who seemed to be enjoying her fear. Her heart pounded as she thought about the man's twisted plan. What if she was next? What if she didn't make it out of there? But before she could make a move, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, blocking her path. "You can try to escape, but you won't get far. No one does. They never do." Rochelle swallowed hard, her palms sweating. She had to find a way out. She couldn't let him win. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone else was coming. Was it the police? Had someone finally figured out what Mr. Thompson was doing? Rochelle's heart skipped a beat as she listened closely, hoping that someone was coming to save her. Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. No one is coming for you. You're here because you're meant to be here. Rochelle could hear the footsteps getting closer, and without thinking, she rushed to the window. She tried to pull the old, rusted bars from the window, but they were too strong. She turned back to Mr. Thompson in a panic. He grinned wickedly. It's no use. This place is my kingdom, and you, my dear, are just another victim. Rochelle's mind raced. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let him win. She glanced around the room again, hoping to find something she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on a rusted pipe near the corner of the room. Without thinking, she grabbed it and held it in front of her, trying to steady her shaking hands. Mr. Thompson let out a low chuckle. You think that will stop me? In that moment, the door to the basement creaked open and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, tall and imposing, wearing a dark coat. Rochelle's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. It was Marco, the man who had disappeared days ago. But something was wrong. His eyes were empty, his face pale and lifeless. He looked like he was under some kind of trance. He moved forward slowly, like a puppet on strings. Marco? Rochelle whispered, her voice trembling. But Marco didn't respond. He just kept moving toward her, his face blank, his steps heavy and robotic. Rochelle's heart sank as she realized that Mr. Thompson had already gotten to him. Marco was no longer the person he once was. He was just another tool in the evil old man's sinister plan. You see, Rochelle, Mr. Thompson said softly, this is how it works. I take what I want. I break them, twist their minds, and then they become part of the collection. You'll understand soon enough. Marco stopped right in front of Rochelle, his cold, lifeless eyes staring at her. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized that this was her future if she didn't escape. She couldn't let herself become one of them. She had to find a way out now. Rochelle's heart raced as Marco stood motionless before her, his blank eyes staring into hers. It was clear that he was no longer in control of himself. His body was there, but his mind, his soul, was gone. And that meant only one thing. She was next. Mr. Thompson, watching from the shadows, seemed to enjoy her fear. His grin widened. You see, Rochelle, Marco has been one of my most successful subjects. After I break their will, they become my helpers. They help me bring in the next. I don't need to kill everyone. Sometimes, all it takes is control. Rochelle took a deep breath. She couldn't let herself fall victim to this madness. She looked at Marco one more time, seeing the torment in his lifeless eyes, and it gave her the strength she needed. She wasn't going to end up like him. She clenched the rusty pipe tighter, determined. As Mr. Thompson spoke, she noticed something in his words, a slip in his otherwise confident demeanor. You're not the first to try and escape, he continued. But it's always the same. They get scared, they panic, and then they stay forever. A plan formed in her mind. Rochelle couldn't overpower him physically. He was bigger and stronger, but she had her wits. She needed to buy herself time. She turned to Marco, the lifeless shell of the man he once was, and spoke to him softly, trying to get through to whatever was left of him. Marco, she whispered, you need to fight this. Please, you're stronger than this. For a moment, Marco's eyes flickered, just for a second, as though he was hearing her. His hand twitched. That was enough. She had to act quickly. Without warning, Rochelle swung the pipe at the chains hanging from the ceiling. The metal collided with the rusted links, and the sound echoed through the basement. Mr. Thompson's expression faltered for just a moment, and that was all the opening she needed. Marco's body jerked, and for the first time since Rochelle had met him, his eyes seemed to show a glimmer of recognition. Rochelle, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Marco, fight it. Rochelle shouted, running toward him. She grabbed his arm and tried to pull him towards the door. But Mr. Thompson wasn't going to let them escape that easily. With a shriek of fury, he lunged forward, grabbing the pipe from Rochelle's hands and tossing it aside. "You won't get away, Rochelle," he hissed. "You're mine now." But Rochelle didn't hesitate. She knew she had one chance left. She turned to Marco, who was still slowly coming back to himself, and screamed, "Run, Marco! We can make it out of here. You have to come with me." Marco blinked several times, his face full of confusion. But then, as though a switch had been flipped, he seemed to snap out of his trance. His eyes were clear again. The fog lifted, and he shoved Mr. Thompson away, pushing him to the ground. "Not again," Marco yelled, his voice trembling with rage. Rochelle didn't wait for another second. She grabbed Marco's arm and yanked him toward the basement door, which was still ajar. They ran up the stairs, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Behind them, they could hear Mr. Thompson's enraged shouts, but they didn't stop. They reached the front door, and just as Rochelle was about to open it, Marco turned to her, his face a mix of confusion and terror. "We can't let him get away with this," he said, his voice desperate. Rochelle's heart pounded, but she knew they couldn't stay. She had to make sure they both escaped. She pushed him through the door and out into the yard. As they ran toward the street, Rochelle heard Mr. Thompson's voice calling out from the house, but it was too late. They were already on their way to safety. The town, as quiet as it was, didn't know what had been happening in the shadows of the old man's house, and Rochelle intended to keep it that way. By the time the sun came up, Rochelle and Marco had gone to the local authorities, telling them everything they had witnessed in Mr. Thompson's house. The police went to the house to investigate, but when they arrived, the place was empty. There were no chains, no dark rooms, no creepy drawings on the walls. It was as if the house had never been anything but an abandoned, dilapidated building. Mr. Thompson was never found, and for a while, the town went back to its quiet, normal life. But Rochelle would never forget the look in Mr. Thompson's eyes as he lunged at her in that basement. She would never forget the way he had controlled people's lives, turning them into his puppets. And she knew one thing for certain. Wherever he was still out there waiting, planning his next move.